This episode may contain sensitive language not suitable for children. Hello, and welcome back to Season 2 of Through Black Eyes Unfiltered, the podcast that brings truth to light. Listen to present-day historical events that shaped our history and will determine our future, as presented by moderator Raymond Dunn and expert Marvin Dunn.
I am Dr. Marvin Dunn. I'm the author of several books dealing with black history in Florida. The first book was on the Miami Riot of 1980, Crossing the Bounds. It was written by myself and Bruce Porter. I've also written Black Miami in the 20th Century, and it deals with the history of lynching in Florida. And my latest book is called A History of Florida Through Black Eyes, and it traces the history of blacks in Florida from the arrival of black people with the Spanish. These books are available on Amazon. In this episode, we will discuss the history of the Black Seminoles, including their origin, traditions, migration, and their relationship with other Seminoles, and a whole lot more.
And I'm very excited about this episode, so let's get started. Marvin, I've got a question for you. Many black families claim to have Indian blood. Could you summarize what Indian blood we have in our family, if any?
Well, we do. Our great-grandfather was a Cherokee Indian who married a black woman, great-grandmother, and that is the origin of Native American blood in our family. But many black families do have, in fact, Native American blood, because back during slavery and even in the earliest part of slavery, some of the Indians actually owned slaves. The Cherokees owned a lot of slaves, the Creeks, Chickasaw, many of these Native American tribes had slaves, and they intermarried. There were also instances in which they didn't intermarry, but they lived together and started to have children. So we have a tremendous amount of Native American blood and African American blood because of the close proximity that Indians and blacks had at the time.
Oh, okay.
So most blacks who say, I have some Indian blood, probably are telling the truth.
Oh.
Now, some of us may be stretching it a little bit, like a straight hair and a little slant in the eyes.
Right.
But you could probably figure that a good percentage of African Americans do have some Native American blood in, and so do white people.
All right.
And they may not be all that quick to admit it, but Native American blood runs through the other races in this country.
Okay. Very interesting. One other thing I'd like to touch on. Who were the Buffalo Soldiers?
Well, we can talk about them. The Buffalo Soldiers were the Black Seminoles who ended up out in the West.
Right.
When they were removed from Florida and were taken up by the government to the West. And the Buffalo Soldiers are the Black Seminoles who decided to help the U.S. Army round up the Plains Indians, the Apache, the Comanches. The Buffalo Soldiers were recognized by the Native Americans as being very woolly looking because they didn't really have barbers out there in the wilderness.
Right,
So these brothers had woolly hair, and the Native Americans thought that, well, they look like buffaloes. So the term Buffalo Soldiers came from that. And then the tradition of the Buffalo Soldiers was kept in the U.S. Army all the way through every war that we have fought up to the composition of the United States Army. Now, the downside about the Buffalo Soldiers is that even though the Black Seminoles had been removed from Florida by force, the Buffalo Soldiers helped the U.S. Army remove Native Americans from the West. So it's kind of a complicated end of the story, but that's who the Buffalo Soldiers were, and we still have them in the U.S. Army today.
And is it true, it's my understanding that one of the reasons that they were used so widely by the Army is because they were able to interpret. Is that right?
Well, no, they weren't interpreters in the West.
Okay.
They were fighters. They hunted meat, and they served the soldiers in different ways. In some instances, it wasn't necessarily fighting, but no, that was the role that the Black Seminoles played in Florida.
So Seminole Wars 1 and 2.
And 3, yes.
And 3.
But talking about the Buffalo Soldiers is at the end of the story. That's where they ended up in the final analysis out west and helping the Army round up the Plains Indians.
Okay, good. For our audience, can you share with us some of the Black Seminole leaders?
Well, hold on. I think what we need to do is talk about who they were.
Okay.
Where they came from. Okay. And then talk about who the leaders were and what happened out west. But let's begin with who were the Black Seminoles. Seminole Indians were not an original Native American tribe. When the U.S. was founded, there was no such thing as Seminole Indians. Various Indian tribes had been here for thousands of years, but not Seminoles. This is important. The Seminoles came along in the 1700s. when white people started crowding them out of their ancestral lands. And some of these tribes started to move down into Florida to get away from being displaced by white settlers. But in 1835, the U.S. Congress, under the leadership of Andrew Jackson as president, passed the Indian Removal Act, which required all of the Native American tribes that were existing east of the Mississippi River be removed. That's the term they use, removed to the west, to reservations in the west.
Yeah, removed. Yeah.
Removed. Now, mind you, these were not savages running around killing people. For example, the Cherokees were a very subtle race. They had schools. Most of them were Christians. They paid their taxes. They were cooperative, productive citizens. But they had to be removed. And most of the Indians did, in fact, end up being removed to the west. Some of them said, no, we're not going. Hell no, we're not going to be forced to leave where we live and go out west. And these Indians started to move down into Florida. And they became known as Seminoles. The word Seminole means wild or will not be controlled. This goes outside of the bounds of what is expected. So Seminole means wild or untamed. So these were Indians who were considered to be untamable. They would not go out west and live on a reservation and do the things that the other Indians were doing. So they were designated as Seminoles. And they were angry. They came into Florida. The Seminoles were very angry about being forced to leave their native ancestral lands. And some of them brought ammunition into Florida, and they were very hostile, and they resisted white efforts to remove them even from Florida.
Do I have it correct that the tribe that we know as the Seminole originally were with the Creeks, right? Because you have the Upper Creeks and the Lower Creeks, and that's the group that they separated from, then became known as Seminoles.
The Seminoles include members of various tribes that were in the South: the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, Mississippi, the Creeks. Most of them were Creek. Osceola was a Creek. So you're right. If you were to check out the average Seminole, he would be a Creek Indian by extraction. But you also had large members of other tribes who were in the Seminole tribe. The Creeks were the most angry. They were the most dangerous. They were the ones who were absolutely determined to resist removal from Florida. But that's the sort of the composition of the Seminole tribe.
Now, the blacks who were being removed, we know that these blacks were mostly escaped slaves coming from South Carolina, Georgia, the surrounding areas. And they were, in many cases, considered freed because during that time, if I understand correctly, under Spanish rule, if a slave escaped from the plantation and made it to Spanish Florida and accepted to be a Catholic as their religion, they were free.
Well, yes, they also had to agree to serve the crown. If there was a war, then the males would have to go and serve the crown. That's very true, but let's make a distinction between the escaped slaves and Black Seminoles. There's a big difference between the two groups. The Black Seminoles are the ones who actually lived with or near the Seminoles, who did not have necessarily Indian blood, but they were identified as Black Seminoles because of the relationship that they had with the Seminoles, which went back, in some cases, generations. So these are Indians, these are black people, and some of them were escaped slaves, but keep in mind, some of them were born in the tribe.
Right.
So they had never been a slave. And that really caused a lot of problems. Here comes the U.S. government saying we're going to round up these escaped slaves, and they start taking Black Seminoles. And this guy's been a Black Seminole for 80 years, and now you're being removed. So the Army couldn't tell which ones were escaped slaves, which ones were really Black Seminoles. So they just rounded up everybody, took them back to Georgia, and that caused a lot of animosity between the American government and the Seminoles because they were taking their family members. Now, escaped slaves came in and did not necessarily associate with or live with the Seminoles. They simply lived and existed wherever they could. Many of them, of course, were caught, but they didn't have any kind of informal relationship with the Seminoles. The Black Seminoles were in cahoots with them. They adopted each other's lifestyles. They shared weapons. They shared everything. But escaped slaves were not a part of that. And then on top of that, I'm sorry, you also got the Geeches who were here. That's another totally different group of blacks in Florida.
I want to ask you about that. Before you mention the Geeches, let's go back to our connection with the Geeches. Do you remember John on Long Island?
You help me with that.
Okay. When we were on Long Island picking potatoes as migrants, there were a number of people in the migrant camp that our father kept referring to as Geeches. We didn't know at the time, we were boys, we didn't know what a Geechee was. Now as a grown man, as we look back over history, come to find out the Geechees are from the Gullah community.
That's correct.
Living off of the east coast of Georgia, South Carolina.
They lived on the Barrier Islands off the Carolinas and off Florida. These were people who had been formerly slaves.
Right.
but who managed to take control of the environment in which they were living. The white people left. The Civil War was one reason why the plantations on those islands were abandoned. So the Civil War happens. You have these black slaves living on these barrier islands. The war disrupts everything. The masters are gone. And all of a sudden, slaves have, hey, there's no boss man. And the boss man never comes back out to those islands. So the culture among the Geeches evolves as a separate entity from what African Americans were experiencing on the plantations on the mainland, what Black Seminoles were experiencing. These were the folks who had deep roots on the coastal islands and who were also displaced eventually, and some of them came down into Florida. That's still a different group, though, from escaped slaves that we're talking about.
Just to clear things up, because we're talking history here, and we're also trying to relate this to present day. In the same area that we're talking about, where the Gula people live today in South Carolina, we now have golf courses. And most of the golf courses and country clubs are named Plantation this and Plantation that because they were originally plantations. One of the things that's going on there today is they're trying to maintain their culture, and the land is being sold for developers. So there's a big fight going on there. I try to keep up with it. And at present, they're pretty much losing the battle.
Well, that's happening all over the place, all over the country. In Florida, moving into the early 1800s, certainly by the 1830s, we have escaped slaves. Most of them came in from Georgia and the Carolinas, who never made really any contact with the Seminoles. We have Black Seminoles, and these are people who had been involved with the Seminoles for many years, some of them born into the tribe, intermarried in the tribe, but not necessarily. They didn't necessarily have Seminole blood now. The association with the Seminoles that makes them Black Seminoles. And then we have the Gullah Geechees, these folks who are not attached to anybody. Well, not exactly. The Geechees, what they did when they first started coming to Florida, they helped the Indians kill white people. The Geechees were fully capable of participating in efforts to resist white intrusion into their community. So these are the groups that we have in Florida in the 1830s trying to survive, and the Black Seminoles were among the most survivable of the groups that we're talking about because they had the association with the tribe.
Now, a part of that association with the tribe just happened to be a protection, give and take on both sides. Because, as I understand it, what the Black Seminoles who lived next to or somewhere adjacent to the Seminole tribes would do for their own protection, at harvest time, they will give to the tribe a certain amount of their harvest. And if they slaughtered something like a hog or a cow or something, they would give the chief a side of beef. And that was that relationship. The other part of that relationship.
Well, hold on. No, I'm sorry. That was the relationship between the Seminoles and their slaves. The Seminoles owned slaves.
Okay, hold on. Now, straighten me up, because, see, that's why I want you to correct me so that people in our audience who think like me, you can correct all of us. Because the flip side of that relationship, as I understood it, was that the Seminole then claimed the blacks as their slaves because when the whites sent in the troops and the slave hunters to try and capture them and take them back to their plantation masters, the Seminoles said, wait a minute, this is our property.
Didn't happen that way. No.
All right.
No. These were slaves owned by the Seminoles Indians. Almost all the Native American tribes owned black people, owned slaves. Not just the Creeks and the Cherokees and Seminoles. So the reason that the Seminole Indians were so upset with the removal of Black Seminoles was that some of them were blood related. They had connections that went back many years. It wasn't a ploy to try to fool the government by just claiming these are Black Seminoles. They were Black Seminoles. They were not pretending to be. They were not escaped slaves who were saying, okay, you can't take us back because we belong to the tribe. No, these were people who had associations with many years with the tribe, and then the soldiers come in and can't tell who's a slave, who belongs to Mr. John up in Savannah, and who's a Black Seminole. So it got complicated. And the Army just took everybody. If you were black and they caught you, they took you back to Georgia.
Now, they took you back to Georgia, back to South Carolina. The Army did.
Yes.
And exactly what did they do with them? Now, you're in the custody of the U.S. Army. Did they take them back to a plantation master?
Yes.
Who then claimed, well, this is mine?
Correct. They took them back to the masters. The ones who could not be identified or associated with a particular master were sold. The Army is removing human beings from Florida, taking them back to slavery. But yes, they took them back to their masters.
May I skip a little bit ahead and ask you, who were some of these individuals in the Army who were doing all of this removal of blacks?
Francis L. Dade, who Dade County is his name. Francis Dade was involved in removing Indians and blacks from Florida when he was killed. So there were others. General Edmund Gaines.
What is it? Gainesville is named?
Gainesville is named after Edmund Gaines. He was the most effective U.S. general who was able to deal with the Seminoles. Edmund Gaines comes into Florida and says, stop chasing the warriors. Stop running out after these guys in Everglades. Get their wives and children. Bring them in, and then the men will come in. And that's exactly what happened. That's how they got the Seminoles out of Florida, by arresting the women and children. Edmund Gaines orchestrated that, and it worked.
Now, tell you what, let's forget about the little people like counties are named after them or cities. What about presidents? General Andrew Jackson. What about Zachary Taylor?
Andrew Jackson's the easiest one to talk about, but we got to come back to Dade and the Dade battle. I want to talk about that because that's the person after whom our county is named. But Andrew Jackson was the second worst president in the history of the country. He was a racist. He was the first populist president, like Trump today, coming from the common man. I'm not worried about what the aristocrats in Washington and the high earners in New York think about me. Andrew Jackson rose as a man of the people in Tennessee, and he had a lot of gathering as a guy who was pushing for America and making way for Americans to expand the country. That was Jackson's plan. He even marched into Florida with an army to capture slaves. So Andrew Jackson was the man who orchestrated the Indian Removal Act, who also led troops into Florida and other places to round up slaves and to kill Indians.
Well, that's the point that I'm trying to make. We have past presidents like Andrew Jackson, Zachary Taylor, who were actually generals in charge of Black Seminole removal.
Yes.
Taking these people back and giving them to the slave masters, and they eventually rose to be president.
But you really can't blame the generals. They were following orders from the commander-in-chief. Some of them carried out these orders with some sense of humanity, and others just ruthlessly did what they were told to do. But you can criticize Jackson for particular incidents that he was a part of or that he ordered, like the attack on the Negro Fort, which we'll talk about later on.
We are.
Yeah. So Jackson orders these things. He's not necessarily on site to be the one to orchestrate them, but he was behind it. And if you go even earlier than Jackson, there were other presidents who ordered operations against blacks that enhanced slavery, and today are shameful.
Well, let's move on then, because I know you would be interested in telling us about the Dade.
The Dade battle?
Yeah, the Dade battle. Tell us about the Dade battle.
Well, let's talk about who Dade was. Major Francis L. de Leghorn Dade was a brevet major in the United States Cavalry. He was in his 30s in 1834 when this happened. Dade was stationed in what's now Tampa. It was called Fort Brooke at that time. And we're talking 1834. At that time, there was a truce. There was a treaty between the U.S. government and the Seminole Indians that the Seminole Indians would occupy the interior of Florida. The white people could have the coastline. So all the land 12 miles along the coast, all that was white people's country, white people's territory. But to go outside of that, to go into the interior, the Army had to have the permission of the Seminole Tribe of the Indians. And Dade, in December of 1834, leaves Tampa, Fort Brooke, with about 104 men, marching where? To Ocala. That meant he had to go into the interior of the state, and they didn't ask permission to do that. So I think December 28th or so, it was cold and rainy, and Dade has his men walking across the swamps, led by a slave named Pacheco. Pacheco's on foot in front, and then Dade is on a horse behind him, and then the troops are behind them. But that's how they were proceeding through the woods. And the men it was raining and cold, so they sort of wrapped themselves up in their big heavy coats. And all of a sudden, these Seminoles spring up in the sawgrass and start shooting. And the first volley, they killed Dade. So Dade is shot off. He's dead before he hits the ground. And then the soldiers, the 100 or so soldiers, gathered themselves up into a little enclosure. They cut down some trees and made a little barricade. And then they all jump in there to try to protect themselves. Big mistake, because now the Indians can just slaughter them all. Rather than scattering out in the sawgrass, they all came together. So the chief said, we can't resist this opportunity to kill these soldiers. So they did. After the Seminoles finished killing, they thought they had killed everybody, all these men who were in this little fort, the Indians left, and then in rode 50 Black Seminoles on saddleless horses up to this pit. These men, some of them still alive and groaning, So the blacks get off their horses and take their knives and cut every throat of every man who was not dead. They were not involved. The Black Seminoles were not involved in the Dade battle itself. They came in, the Indians would let them. So the Black Seminoles come in after the Dade battle is over, kill the rest of the people, and then here's Pacheco, a slave who was leading them through the woods, and when the first shots were fired, he fell to the ground and pretended to be dead. But now that the battle was over, he stands up and says, I'm a slave, they made me come, I'm not here on my own accord. So one of the chiefs, Jumper was his name, takes Pacheco with him, and eventually when Jump is made to move to Texas or Mexico, he takes Pacheco with him. But that's the extent of the Dade battle. Dade was killed, he was made into a hero, even though he was violating a treaty when he was killed. Had no business being where he was, and then they glorified his death. I've seen paintings. There's a huge one in the museum downtown showing the Dade battle, and there's Dade standing and the firing all around him, and he's shooting at the Indians. The man was dead. The Indians killed the leader first. Then they deal with the other people after that. But anyway, a lot of places started being named after Dade. There's even a statue of Dade in the quadrangle at West Point. He was really not a particularly effective officer. He got himself killed and most of his men.
So all of us proud Dade Countyans should understand
that we live in a county that was named after a failed army officer who got himself and almost all of his men killed. I think only 2 men survived that, other than Pacheco.
And what he was trying to do, in part, was to remove black people and take them back to plantations.
Well, particularly what Dade was doing was taking a cannon from Tampa to Ocala. So the army would have even more killing power to wipe out the Indians.
I dare not ask you to tell our audience about Broward.
Napoleon Broward.
One day on another program, I'm going to ask you so that our Broward County listeners can also understand.
I'll tell you one thing about Broward.
All right.
Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, governor of Florida, felt that the only solution to the race problem in Florida was for the blacks in Florida to be returned to Africa. The Broward County namesake wanted black people removed from Florida because he said there'll never be peaceful existence in Florida, even in the country, between black people and white people. But that's another story.
Okay, I'll wait and ask questions about that in a later episode. Let me bring you back to some of the Black Seminole leaders. You've already spoken of a couple of them, but let's go a little deeper with Abraham and John Horse especially.
Well, Abraham comes earlier. He was a Black Seminole, and Abraham and John Horse and the other Black Seminole leaders all of them did the same thing. They were interpreters for the Seminoles. They were the go-between the Seminoles and the army. The Seminoles didn't speak English. The Black Seminoles, many of them having been slaves, spoke both languages. So the main role that Black Seminole leaders served was as interpreters. Take, for example, the last Seminole chief, Micanopy, would not go any place without Abraham.
Right.
Abraham slept in his village rather than in the Seminole village.
Because he became more of his advisor than his interpreter, I understand.
That's correct.
He actually trusted Abraham.
Abraham was a man sitting down at the table with the army officers, with the Seminoles, looking at the documents that the Indians were being asked to sign, reading them, and telling the Indians what the documents contained. So they were in a very pivotal position during these negotiations.
And because Abraham had lived amongst the white people,
correct,
the chief trusted him because he knew their ways and things, and so he actually trusted. Now, John Horse.
Well, John Horse was the most memorable of the Black Seminole leaders. He was born near Tampa when the Army was very active. He was a mixed race, black and Indian, probably more black than Indian. And he emerged because he lived on the Army base. He knew the Army ways. He could interpret for the Indians, and he kept going out into the wilderness where he learned a lot of the Native American ways and made contact with them as well. So he eventually left and became a Black Seminole, joined the Black Seminoles, and was a chief interpreter for them, but he was also a fighter.
Let's make a distinction between Abraham, because Abraham was an earlier advisor.
That's right.
And during the first Indian War. John Horse, I understand, was 12.
Third comes in near the end.
John Horse was 12 years old at the beginning of the second Indian War, so he had a major role to play there.
That's
Abraham
right.
had a major role to play during the first Indian War. One of the interesting
wait, before we leave John Horse, just so you know, I mean, he was one of the Black Seminoles who stood with the Seminoles, who was courageous, who earned a reputation as being a very handsome man. Even men thought he was handsome.
6 feet tall.
He was a very handsome man. But the main thing that John Horse did was to convince more and more of the Seminoles to give up and be removed to the west. John Horse saw the writing on the wall. He knew the Seminoles couldn't survive in Florida. He knew that the best role that he could play would be to try to get the best deal he could for the Seminoles and the Black Seminoles. He's been criticized in history for having been too helpful to get the Seminoles and the Black Seminoles removed from Florida. On the other hand, had he not done what he did, probably far more of them would have been killed in the wilderness.
Could you confirm whether or not this historical tale is true, that John Horse was also called Gofer John?
Yeah, he was.
The reason he was called Gofer John is because one day he was near the fort and his mom had sent him out to look for food. They had a sack with some turtle eggs in it, 2 turtle eggs, and somehow they got him to come into the fort, and the general asked what was in the bag. John Horse said, "Gopher eggs." The general said, "I'll buy them for him." They gave him a quarter, told him, "I'll buy as many as you can bring," because he was going to have a festival of some sort. So for several weeks or days, every day John Horse would come to the fort, give him 2 turtle eggs, get a quarter, which he gave to his mom and dad to help buy ammunition to fight. And
I don't know about that last part, because he was a boy at 12, 14, 15 years old. He was very good at going out into the sandy area outside of the fort and catching these animals and bringing them back, and then monitoring with the chiefs and the other Indians for things that he would get for having provided that service. But they didn't give him weapons or guns.
No. My understanding from the story is that the reason the way he got the name Gofer John is because the chiefs officers kept giving him a quarter every day. He came with 2 eggs. And then when the general got ready to have the festival and asked to have all of the eggs and things prepared, they looked and there were only 2 eggs. Come to find out, he sold them the same 2 eggs every day.
Yeah,
so the general actually named him Gofer John.
Yeah, I think the story is correct, except that he had the name Gofer John even before that, because he was going out for a long period of months, going out providing this service to the soldiers. But the most important role that he played, as I said, was as a go-between between the Seminole Tribe and the U.S. government, the Army in particular, in getting Seminole leaders, chiefs, to come in and be removed to the west.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode.
And we invite you to join us next week for another exciting episode.
We'd like to thank our sponsors, Aris Crown All Natural Products and Clockwork Tracks, for providing our podcast music. Special thanks also to our editor, Track 53, as well as HGAB Studios and MRD2 Media.
Fact checkers are Dr. Marvin Dunn and Dr. Raymond Dunn.
I'm Dr. Raymond Dunn, and I'm the author of 2 children's storybooks. My first storybook is The Little Scrub Christmas Tree. It's the story of a little tree that finds itself growing up in a Christmas tree forest. In this story, I have embedded many lessons that young children might learn that will help them as they mature. My second book is The Robin That Could Not Sing. And this is the story of a little bird that tried very hard to be like all of the other birds. And there are also lots of lessons involved in this book that young children might pick up as they read the story that would help them in their everyday lives and other obstacles that might come their way. These books are available on Amazon.
You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter at TBE Unfiltered, or go to our website at tbeunfiltered.com.
And when you do, don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe.
See you next week.